is Neil Kuhner. Neil is completing Project 2 in the Competent Communication Manual. His objectives are: select an outline that allows listeners to easily follow his speech, have a clear message with supporting documentation, use appropriate transitions, create a strong opening and conclusion. Neil is fascinated by the suffering religious intolerance has caused through our history, and sincerely hopes his speech doesn't offend anyone. He wants you to be aware that if tomatoes are thrown, he has instructed various members of the audience to punch the tomato throwers in the face. He may or may not reimburse for legal fees based on the amount of damage inflicted. His speech is titled, "My God is Better Than Your God," and it will run 7 to 9 minutes. Please.
Religion. It can evoke strong feelings, or in my case, no feelings at all. It can be described as being spiritual, believing in a higher power, subscribing to a faith. It can be powerful and soothing to its believers. But one thing is certain: over thousands of years, religion is the spark that has ignited wars and atrocities. Let's look at a few examples of religious intolerance in recent history. First, we're going to look at the conflict in Northern Ireland. Second, we're going to look at the struggle in the Mideast between the Sunni and the Shia. And third, we are going to take a somewhat humorous, yet non-confrontational look at my first foray into Catholicism.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, it has become clear over thousands of years that my God is better than your God. Nevertheless, I will argue that the world would be a better place if we could look past our differences, focus on what we have in common, to build stronger relationships and even stronger bonds. So let's journey back 50 years to a time in history that is known as the Troubles. Now, I realize the conflict in Northern Ireland extends many hundreds of years, but the period I want to focus on is a period from 1968 to 1998. During this period, over 3,600 people were killed. Over 50,000 people were injured. Now, there were 4 main reasons for the period known as the Troubles. One, there was the obvious difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. 2, there was an intense hatred by the Irish towards the British, and this hatred was further fueled by a lack of voting rights for Catholics. Number 3, there was economic inequalities. The Catholics were 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed than their fellow Protestants. And 4th, there was the allocation of public housing. 71% of all public housing went to Protestants, while the Catholics were the ones with larger families. So rightfully, the Catholics felt discriminated against and they felt alienated. And I ask you, could we have saved thousands of lives if we were the people of Northern Ireland were a little bit more inclusive and less autocratic? I believe the answer to that question is yes. Religious tolerance could have saved thousands of lives. Now let's look at the conflict we're currently experiencing in the Middle East between the Sunni and the Shia. Now it's important to take note that of the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, 90% of them are Sunni. The rest are Shia. And those Shia reside predominantly in 5 countries. They reside in Iran, Iraq, India, Pakistan, and Syria. Now, let's look at the major differences. The major differences are really 2. So the major differences are: 1 is who they believe the legitimate successor is to the Prophet Muhammad. The Sunnis believe that legitimate successor is Abu Bakr. The Shia believe it is Ali. Now, second the Sunni believe in something called the Sunnah, which is a record of teachings and principles by the Prophet Muhammad to guide them in their everyday lives. The Shiites rely more on the Ayatollahs, who they view as godlike figures on earth to guide them through their everyday affairs in life. Now, to put it in terms Christians might more easily understand, the Shiites are more like Catholics, in that they venerate the Holy Family and attend to their shrines. The Sunnis, they are more like a militant brand of Protestantism. They denounce an intermediary between God and the individual and actually will destroy shrines to saints. Now, the conflict in the Middle East that we're currently experiencing can almost entirely be blamed on the United States. You see, when we took out Saddam Hussein, he was a Sunni. And he was governing a majority Shiite population. We created a power vacuum. And that power vacuum was exploited by the Shiites. And it's sad to say that in the two Iraqi wars, over 1 million Iraqis were killed. And over 1 million Iraqis were killed. And of those 1 million Iraqis that were killed, this represents roughly 4% of their population. Now, to put that in perspective, if 4% of our population were killed, that would translate into roughly 12 million dead. So, not only, to be fair, the United States only killed about 500,000 Iraqis. The rest was killed, they were killed by sectarian violence. Now, additionally, 2 million Sunnis fled Iraq. And half of those went to Syria. Now, if you recall, I told you Syria was predominantly a Shiite nation. So do you think there's any correlation between what we're seeing in Syria today and that Sunni migration? I think that the answer to that is yes. But again, sadly, just as in Northern Ireland, religious tolerance could have saved almost 1 million lives. Now let's look at my somewhat humorous example of my first foray into Catholicism. I recently started dating my wife, Andrea, and I was invited to their farm in upstate New York to celebrate Easter. Everything was going just fine until her dad asked me to join them for Catholic Mass on Sunday. Wanting to sound confident, I said, sure, of course, I'll be there. Well, meanwhile, in the back of my mind, I am thinking, what the hell have I gotten myself into? Needless to say, didn't go very well. Drove the family to church, got out of the car, clutching my can of Pepsi, started heading toward the church. Dad taps me on the shoulder and said, Neil, this isn't bring your own. Well, hadn't even entered the church, and already I was at strike one. So then, we're entering the pew, and Andrea's explaining to me the Last Supper and characters of the Last Supper, in particular Pontius Pilate. I promptly nicknamed him Pancho and made him a Mexican. Well, her dad overheard this, and I could tell by the scowl on his face that I was already at strike two, and the sermon had not even begun. Now, I was having a little trouble following the sermon when I realized that I might have mistakenly entered a fitness club. Stand, sit, kneel, stand, sit, kneel. I was getting winded. And then finally I see these guys, bouncer-looking dudes, huge. They got baskets on the end of long sticks. And they're walking down the pews. And people are putting money in the baskets. And I knew I shouldn't have said it. But I leaned over to Mike, and as the baskets got closer to our pew, and I said, Mike, is this help yourself? Be right. Next came the Holy Communion. Mike, knowing I was a little bit of a drinker, said, Neil, you head on up there. They'll give you some wine. I said, Mike, at this point I felt I had nothing to lose. I said, Mike, if they serve bourbon, I'd come every week. So at that point, a smile broke across his face, and I realized I had redemption. broke across his face, he started laughing, and I realized I'd survived my first Catholic Mass unscathed. Later on at Easter dinner, my shenanigans at church were the topic of conversation. Yet I was pleased to know that her family had accepted me for who I was. And I'd ask you now, wouldn't the world be a better place if we were more appreciative of each other's differences and could rally around what we have in common with one another and to build stronger relationships and bonds? And lastly, I'd like to say that in my foray into Catholicism, no one was either killed nor injured.